At street level in central Brooklyn, Dean Street is not a place that asks for attention. It is a line of ordinary blocks with ordinary traffic, where the city's history is stored in building setbacks and brickwork rather than monuments. But the New York City subway does not respect the surface. It cuts across it, under it, and in older corners of the system, over it. Steel, timber, and ballast laid down to solve yesterday's problems and then left to age into today's constraints. The title Dean Street Station still circulates in transit lists and private maps of loss, a name that once meant a stop, a staircase, a paid fare, a platform edge. Its closure, reported as a rare event in modern New York, was described plainly at the time. It shut just after midnight, and it was noted as the first station closure in decades. The station most people mean when they say Dean Street was on the Franklin Avenue Shuttle, the short connector in Brooklyn that has been rebuilt, broken down, and rebuilt again. It is recorded as having closed permanently in 1995 and then physically removed during the line's reconstruction in the late 1990s. A long-running catalog of abandoned stations states it more starkly: destroyed 1998 after closing in 1995. But the title we are investigating attaches Dean Street to a different structure, the IRT Eastern Parkway Line. The Eastern Parkway Line is not a shuttle. It is a main artery of the A Division, built for the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, the IRT, New York's first subway operator, stretching from downtown Brooklyn east along Eastern Parkway toward Crown Heights and beyond. It is a hard-working trunk line, carrying multiple services and handling complicated merges and express running patterns that in the modern era are controlled by signal systems and dispatchers. So the first unease in this story is administrative. It is the kind of mismatch that happens in old systems where names migrate, memories compress, and records are copied by people who were not there. Dean Street belongs historically to the Franklin Avenue line. Eastern Parkway belongs to the IRT. And yet, when you look at Brooklyn's transit geography, not the neat colored diagram on the map, but the actual convergence of structures, transfers, and interlockings, those worlds touch. Sometimes they press against each other so closely that the distinction becomes academic to the person standing in a dim passageway listening for an arriving train. The IRT Eastern Parkway Line begins its Brooklyn run in the dense knot of downtown, Borough Hall and the Atlantic Avenue Barclays Center complex nearby, and then it moves east through stations whose architecture is familiar to anyone who has waited there: tiled name tablets, heavy columns, and the steady particulate drift that never fully settles. Stations like Bergen Street and Nostrand Avenue are not backdrops. They are working rooms where mechanical tolerances are continually tested by volume. A photograph of Bergen Street's platforms shows the typical depth and geometry of the line: columns in rows, hard lighting, the sense of a long chamber that narrows into darkness at both ends. Nostrand Avenue Station, further east, is another example of the line's scale and burden: a heavy interchange area close to the point where services split and where small failures become visible because they affect so many people at once. At Franklin Avenue, the Eastern Parkway Line also meets the rebuilt shuttle complex. The station there is part of the same transit ecosystem as the old Dean Street stop, even if it is not the same line. The title's claim, closed after repeated operational failures, does not align with the public's summary of Dean Street's permanent closure on the Franklin Shuttle, which has been attributed to a mix of low ridership, fare evasion, and redundancy with nearby Franklin Avenue Station. Yet, even that official phrasing hides the physical reality: a station that was close to another station because the neighborhood was dense and the line was old, a platform on an aging structure, access points that became difficult to control, a stop that did not justify its own risk. Those are operational considerations, even when the word failure is avoided. And the deeper issue is that operational failure in New York Transit is rarely a single incident. It is an accumulation, a a station design that makes safe operation expensive, an alignment that causes braking irregularities, a signal block whose occupancy behaves unpredictably because water is where it should not be. The public hears signal problems and imagines an abstract malfunction. In practice, a signal failure is a physical event, a circuit shorted by salt water, a relay chattering from heat stress, a cable sheath breached by vibration. When it repeats, the line becomes conditioned. Operators approach a certain area with caution. Dispatchers expect delays. Maintainers learn the location by a tired familiarity. On this line, on these old Brooklyn trunks, the city's most unsettling feature is not abandonment, it is endurance. The Eastern Parkway Line was built in the early era of the subway's expansion into Brooklyn, with significant sections opening as the system grew eastward. Crown Heights Utica Avenue, a key station on the trunk, is recorded as opening on August 23, 1920. That date matters because it pins the physical age of the corridor, more than a century of vibration, seepage, repairs, and retrofits layered on top of the original concrete and steel. Dean Street, as a station name, opened and closed more than once, another marker of instability rather than mystery. The record of Dean Street Station on the Franklin Line notes that it opened and closed twice in its history, a detail that reads like a footnote but functions like a warning. A station that opens and closes is a station that cannot find a stable justification in the life of the city. It is not merely unused, it is argued over, evaluated, and returned to operation under conditions that are never fully right. In the documentary record, the 1995 closure of Dean Street was treated as notable precisely because closures are rare in the modern subway. The system prefers to keep everything open, even when it is degraded, because closure is an admission that the network cannot maintain its footprint. That is why a station's disappearance carries more weight than a station's decline. A station can be neglected for decades and still operate. To close it is to acknowledge that operation itself has become a hazard. The title we are working from insists on a different emphasis, not ridership or redundancy, but repeated operational failures. To understand how that claim could attach itself to Dean Street in the context of the IRT Eastern Parkway Line, we have to follow the way information actually travels in transit systems, through work orders, radio calls, control center logs, maintenance notes, and the memory of crews who learn a line by the sound it makes under load. There are places in Brooklyn where the system's divisions blur, where a shuttle structure runs near an IRT trunk, where transfer corridors turn the subway into a single organism, and where a failure in one part is felt as a symptom elsewhere. Riders do not differentiate by corporate history, IRT, BMT, IND. They differentiate by experience, a platform that always smells wet, a tunnel that always forces trains to crawl, a station where the lights flicker in a particular pattern during summer heat. In that environment, a closed station does not vanish cleanly. When Dean Street was demolished during the Franklin Line's reconstruction, it left almost nothing visible at street level, an absence that encourages reinvention. The city is full of such absences, places where a station house once stood, where a stairwell once cut down through the sidewalk, where a sign once gave a name to a set of steps. And when a station is removed, what remains is not only steel and concrete, it is also the problem that closure was meant to solve. If the closure was driven by control issues, fare evasion, platform supervision, maintenance access, then the story becomes one of operations, the ability of the system to function safely as a machine that depends on human compliance. That kind of failure repeats because the underlying conditions repeat. Crowding, staffing limitations, equipment that is always in partial repair. To document this properly, we have to start where the system is most honest, in the unromantic details. The Eastern Parkway Line is a 4-track trunk in places. It carries express and local services that must be sequenced through interlockings, complex track junctions controlled by signals and switches. The Franklin shuttle intersects the life of that trunk through transfers and shared neighborhoods, bringing riders into the same stations where the IRT runs beneath. The name Dean Street can drift across that seam and settle in the wrong place, especially in unofficial retellings. And when it does, the misplacement is not harmless. It allows a different kind of account to form, one that is less about the economics of ridership and more about the mechanics of things going wrong. By the time the station closed in 1995, the subway system had already lived through the era when deferred maintenance became policy. Even without naming a single disaster, New York's transit history in the late 20th century is defined by what did not get fixed. Failures were not surprises, they were patterns. The most disturbing part is that patterns can become accepted as normal. A signal problem becomes a daily delay. A platform problem becomes a familiar announcement. A station that cannot be controlled becomes a quiet liability everyone works around until the day somebody decides to stop pretending. Dean Street's last night, described as a closure just after midnight, was not dramatic. That is the point. It did not need to be. In cities, the most consequential endings rarely announce themselves. They happen on schedule changes, on maintenance memos, on the removal of a sign. The station closes, the trains keep running, and for a while the absence feels temporary until it becomes permanent. The unease begins when you ask what the station was, in operational terms, before it was closed. Not what it meant to riders, but what it demanded from the system: staffing, policing, inspection, power, lighting, structural monitoring. That is where repeated failures live, not in a single catastrophe, but in the quiet arithmetic of risk. And in Brooklyn, where lines intersect and histories overlap, the name Dean Street becomes less a location than a warning label, a reminder that the subway, for all its daily familiarity, is a machine that can decide, without drama, that a place is no longer safe to stop. To understand operational failure in a subway system, it helps to discard the map. The map is a promise: clean geometry, consistent spacing, a colored line that implies continuity. Operational reality is the opposite. It is a chain of dependencies where a small defect repeated in the same place can produce the illusion of intention. The IRT Eastern Parkway Line, as documented, is a main Brooklyn chunk built for the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, carrying multiple services and moving large volumes through downtown Brooklyn and along Eastern Parkway. Its stations, Bergen Street, Nostrand Avenue, Franklin Avenue, Eastern Parkway Brooklyn Museum, Crown Heights, Utica Avenue, are not merely stops. They are mechanical segments where trains slow, accelerate, merge, and diverge, consuming the finite capacity of track and signal blocks. This is why the title's phrase, "repeated operational failures," matters. It suggests something more specific than decay. Operational failure implies that the station or its immediate infrastructure caused disruptions that could not be corrected by routine maintenance. That kind of problem can be structural, electrical, or procedural. It can be as blunt as a platform too short for longer trains, one of the reasons City Hall Station closed in Manhattan decades earlier, or as subtle as a relay room that overheats at predictable times and trips a circuit that then has to be manually reset. The Eastern Parkway Line has its own known stress points. One of the most discussed bottlenecks in this part of Brooklyn is the junction east of Franklin Avenue, where services split toward Nostrand Avenue. In rail enthusiast literature and accident summaries, that branching is described in direct terms, including past derailments in the area. A Flatbush Ave-bound number 2 train derailed south of the Franklin Avenue station at the point where the Nostrand Avenue line branches off from the Eastern Parkway. Even when no major accident occurs, a junction like this concentrates risk because it concentrates decisions: switch alignment, signal timing, train spacing, operator compliance. Now place the Franklin Avenue shuttle into this environment. Dean Street Station, historically, belonged to that shuttle, not to the IRT trunk. Its permanent closure in 1995 is explicitly documented, and its later demolition is also documented. But the shuttle's operational life is tied to the larger system. It is a feeder, a transfer, a pressure valve that can either distribute riders or concentrate them at Franklin Avenue. In a system like this, a small, poorly controlled station can cause failures beyond its footprint. When a station struggles with fare control, it increases the number of people on platforms who have not passed through monitored points. When a station's access points are difficult to supervise, it affects emergency response times and complicates evacuations. When a station's structure is compromised, it forces speed restrictions that ripple outward. These are not dramatic failures. They are the kind that repeat because they are induced by conditions that do not change. The New York Transit Museum's public note about Dean Street points to 3 contributing factors in its final closure: high fare evasion, low ridership, and the station's proximity, only 3 blocks, to Franklin Avenue. In administrative language, those are policy reasons. In operational language, they are indicators of control failure. Fare evasion is not simply lost revenue, it is a signal that the station's boundaries have failed: turnstiles bypassed, gates forced, unpaid circulation normalized. Low ridership is not simply underuse, it is a reason to reduce staffing, which further reduces control. Proximity to another station is not simply redundancy, it is a way to transfer risk to a better-built node. When a station is only a few blocks from a larger transfer point, the system can treat it as disposable. The disposable station becomes a place where maintenance is deferred first, because any closure can be justified as a minor inconvenience. Deferred maintenance does not usually announce itself in inspection reports as neglect. It appears as a list: corroded stair stringers, cracked platform edge, water infiltration, lighting failures, recurring trip hazards. On the Franklin Shuttle's former Dean Street stop, the physical evidence is largely gone. That absence is itself operationally useful. A demolished station cannot generate complaints about lighting or crime, cannot serve as a hiding place, cannot become a refuge during service disruptions. It removes a variable from the line. But the title insists on a darker reason: repeated operational failures, as if the station had become a site where the system's capacity to function was repeatedly compromised. To approach that claim without leaving realism, we need to look at how failures are experienced on the Eastern Parkway trunk, because even if the station name is misassigned, the pattern described could be true of the corridor that surrounds the Franklin Avenue complex. The Eastern Parkway stations are built like chambers. Photographs of platforms at stations like Bergen Street show the familiar geometry: columns, tile, the platform edge, and the long perspective where the tunnel compresses into a rectangle of darkness. In those spaces, sound behaves differently. Announcement speakers distort. Footsteps arrive before the person. A train can be heard as a low mechanical presence long before its headlights appear. Operational failures, unexpected stops between stations, trains held at signals, are felt as changes in sound first. The platform goes quiet in the wrong way. Signal failures, when they occur repeatedly, teach crews to anticipate them. A social media update about signal malfunction on Eastern Parkway is a modern example of how these issues surface publicly, in brief, almost casual messages. But behind the message is a chain of field investigations: maintainers dispatched, relay cases opened, cable runs traced, voltage measured. The same place generating the same issue becomes a known scar. Operational failure can also emerge from power infrastructure. Brooklyn's trunk lines run through areas where utility networks are old, where water tables and sewers complicate subgrade stability, and where salt intrusion from winter street treatment migrates into underground spaces. A signal system depends on insulation and predictable conductivity. Water turns those assumptions into variables.
A station like Franklin Avenue, which is both an IRT stop and a transfer to the shuttle, becomes a site where variable conditions concentrate. Riders crowd there during disruptions. Crews are forced to short-turn trains nearby. Dispatchers compress headways. In that compression, small equipment flaws become operational failures because there is no slack. This is where the title's insistence can be understood, not as a claim that Dean Street was literally on the Eastern Parkway Line, but that the area associated with Dean Street, the corridor feeding into Franklin Avenue, became known for repeated breakdowns that were managed through partial measures.
The most unsettling thing about repeated failures is how quickly people accept them. They become ritual. Riders learn to stand in certain places because the doors will align imperfectly. They learn that the train will hold in a particular tunnel segment. They learn to interpret a specific pitch of brake squeal as a sign of congestion ahead. None of this is supernatural. It is conditioning. The Eastern Parkway Line's expansion history, including its early 20th century construction and later growth toward Crown Heights Utica Avenue, is part of what makes these patterns persistent. The corridor's age means that modern operational demands are being imposed on structures designed for earlier traffic volumes and different rolling stock assumptions. Crown Heights Utica Avenue's opening in 1920 fixes the era of the line's core Brooklyn extension. The line has been maintained and modified, but its geometry remains. Junctions remain where they were laid out, ventilation shafts remain where they were built, drainage pathways remain where gravity allowed them. And the Franklin Shuttle, historically unstable enough that its stations opened and closed in cycles, adds another layer, a smaller line that has repeatedly fallen below the system's priority threshold. Dean Street's own record of opening and closing twice in its history is a quiet sign of that instability. When operational failures repeat in a low-priority segment, they're handled differently. A major trunk line failure is attacked because it affects thousands immediately. A minor station failure is managed through workarounds: signage, taped-off areas, temporary lighting, increased patrol for a month, and then less. Over time, the minor station becomes a place where rules are applied inconsistently, which is itself an operational hazard. This is how patterns become strange without ever leaving realism. A station can develop a reputation for being unreliable: lights that fail during rain, turnstiles that jam, stairwells that flood. Crews might log the same issues again and again. Riders might stop reporting them. Eventually, the failures are not incidents, they are the station's baseline condition. Dean Street's closure in 1995 was described publicly as a policy decision, but it carried the weight of an operational conclusion, that the system could not justify continuing to manage that particular risk. The later demolition, recorded plainly as part of reconstruction, suggests something stronger, not merely closing the station, but erasing the possibility of reopening it under future political pressure. In transit systems, that kind of finality is reserved for places where repeated failure is not expected to improve. The city may tolerate discomfort, it may tolerate delays, but it does not easily tolerate a location that repeatedly forces the system into unsafe or unmanageable operation. The darkest period in any infrastructure story is rarely the moment of collapse. It is the long interval when people know what is wrong, adjust their behavior around it, and continue anyway. In the early 1990s, the New York City subway was operating under the familiar pressures of aging equipment, crowded service, and the legacy of deferred maintenance. Operational risk was not an abstract concept. It was present in the way stations were staffed, in the condition of structures, and in the uneven reliability of signals and power. Dean Street on the Franklin Avenue shuttle had the kind of profile that makes a station vulnerable: short spacing to a nearby transfer hub, low ridership compared to adjacent stations, and a documented struggle with fare control. The Transit Museum's note about its permanent closure points to those factors directly. This is how the story is usually told, an administrative decision justified by efficiency. But when you reconstruct what high fare evasion means in operational terms, the tone changes. Fare evasion at a small station is a form of systematic boundary breach. It means the station is not, in practice, a controlled environment. Control matters because the subway is engineered around predictable flows. The platform edge is a hazard mitigated by rules. People wait behind the line, trains stop at fixed points, doors open to a known crowd. When the station becomes uncontrolled, when entry and exit are not consistently monitored, then the station's population includes people who are not participating in the rules, not because they are inherently dangerous, but because they have already demonstrated that the station's controls do not apply to them. In a system built on compliance, that is operational failure. During this period, the Franklin Shuttle itself was regarded as fragile. A station that opened and closed twice in its history suggests decades of changing commitment to the line's upkeep. Operational fragility does not only mean broken trains, it means the entire environment, stairs, lighting, railings, fare equipment, operates with diminished redundancy. When one element fails, there is nothing behind it. In interviews and recollections that circulate in transit communities, there is a consistent tone about Dean Street and its final years, a place that felt neglected, a stop people used only when they had to, a station that seemed to exist in a gap between official responsibility and the daily improvisation of crews. These are not extraordinary claims. They are the predictable product of a station that the system does not want to invest in because it can be bypassed. The Eastern Parkway trunk, a few blocks away through the Franklin Avenue transfer complex, carried its own burden. Where the line branches and merges, where the Nostrand Avenue line splits from the Eastern Parkway route, there is documented history of derailment events, including a case described in a public accident summary. A Flatbush Ave-bound No. 2 train derailed south of the Franklin Avenue station at the point where the Nostrand Avenue line branches off from the Eastern Parkway. Incidents like this do not remain isolated in institutional memory. They become part of how dispatchers and operators perceive a segment of track. A junction gains a reputation. Crews approach it differently. That difference becomes another variable in operation. This is where the story's two tracks, Dean Street and the Eastern Parkway Line, begin to overlap in the way riders and workers experience the system. The station name may belong to the shuttle, but the operational atmosphere, crowding, irregularity, repeated service changes, belongs to the whole area. In the months before the 1995 closure, the station's problems were not described publicly as a series of dramatic events. They were described as conditions. That distinction matters. A dramatic event invites investigation and repair. A condition invites adaptation. If a station's stairwell lighting fails repeatedly, people adjust. They step more carefully, they avoid it at night, they move to Franklin Avenue instead. If a turnstile is consistently bypassed, the station becomes an unmonitored entry point into the system. If the platform is routinely undersupervised, operators may hold trains longer to ensure safe boarding, which creates minor delays that accumulate. Repeated operational failures are often measured not in casualties, but in minute-by-minute system degradation. Trains held, headways widened, dispatchers forced to space service because one segment cannot be trusted to behave normally.
The horror of this is not spectacle. It is the calm persistence of a machine working around a defect. On the Eastern Parkway trunk, stations themselves reinforce that mood. Photographs of typical platforms, rows of columns, hard overhead lighting, tunnel mouths that swallow sound, show how quickly the environment becomes psychologically narrowing when service is disrupted. A crowded platform during normal operation can feel manageable because trains arrive predictably. A crowded platform during a delay feels different.
The air becomes warmer, the noise becomes intermittent, a distant rumble, then nothing. People look down the tunnel not because they expect to see something unusual, but because the absence of the train becomes its own presence. The Franklin Avenue station on the Eastern Parkway Line, documented visually in structural catalogs, is a transfer point where these pressures are concentrated. When operational failures occur nearby, switch problems, signal malfunctions, congestion at the junction, the station becomes a holding area. And holding areas create their own risks: platform crowding, frustration, and the subtle erosion of rule following. In September 1995, when Dean Street closed just after midnight, the public framing emphasized its rarity, the first station closure since 1962. The New York Times, that detail is important because it tells you what closure means institutionally. It is a last resort. The system will tolerate almost anything before it admits that a station cannot be operated safely or economically. The closing itself was quiet. The trains continued to run, the line continued to function. That quietness can be mistaken for harmlessness. In reality, the quietness is a sign that the decision was administrative, not reactive. It was made after long exposure to repeated problems that were no longer worth solving. After closure, the physical station persisted for a short time in the way closed stations do. Darkened platforms visible from passing trains, locked entrances, signage removed or covered. This stage is often when the most disturbing accounts form because the closed station becomes a blind spot. The subway's daily life continues around a place that has been deliberately removed from passenger access, creating a cavity in the system, an area of space and structure that still exists but is no longer supposed to be occupied. This is the phase where maintenance workers become the only regular witnesses. Their presence is routine, and their language is technical. If a closed station is used for storage, if a relay cabinet is installed there, if a section of platform is used as a staging area during nighttime work, those details may exist only in work orders and internal notes. The public sees nothing. The trains pass. The darkness behind the columns becomes just another blurred image in the window. And then, in the late 1990s, the station was not merely left closed, it was removed. A catalog of abandoned stations states it was destroyed during the reconstruction of the Franklin Shuttle after its 1995 closure. That is an unusual outcome. Many closed stations remain as ghosts, platforms sealed, tiles intact, a hidden room in the system. Demolition is cleaner. It is also more final. It is in this demolition that the darkest implication of repeated operational failures becomes clear. The system did not want Dean Street to return, even as a possibility. It did not want the station to become a bargaining chip or a nostalgic restoration project. It removed it from the inventory of places that might someday be reopened. Operationally, demolition eliminates a liability. Psychologically, it eliminates a memory. But memory is not only architecture, it is also the set of behaviors that formed around the station's decline. When Dean Street disappeared, the problems that had been concentrated there did not disappear with it. They migrated. Fare evasion did not end. It shifted to other stations and other gates. Crowding did not end. It shifted to Franklin Avenue and nearby stops. Staffing did not increase. It was redistributed. The Eastern Parkway trunk continued to carry its loads through stations like Nostrand Avenue, where the system's complexity is visible in the density of service and the proximity to major junctions. The junction south of Franklin Avenue remained a site where small errors and equipment failures could cascade, as documented in historical accident summaries. When people describe a corridor as cursed, they usually mean it repeats the same failures regardless of what is replaced. In a subway system, repetition is almost always explainable: geometry, water, aging cables, institutional resource limits. The horror is that explanation does not reduce the effect. Knowing why the lights fail does not make the darkness less real when you are standing in it.
By the late 1990s, Dean Street had become not a place you could visit, but a name you could attach to a feeling that certain parts of the system are not merely old, but worn into patterns that cannot be corrected without removing them entirely.
After a station closes, the city continues to speak around the silence it creates. In the first months after the 1995 shutdown, Dean Street existed as an absence on a living line. The closure was recorded in the public record as a rare event, a station shuttered just after midnight, noted for its significance in a system that almost never retracts. For riders who had used it, the practical change was simple: walk a few blocks farther to Franklin Avenue. For the system, the change was more subtle: a boundary removed, a variable eliminated, a point of chronic management replaced by a longer sidewalk. In the subway, that kind of decision is treated as rational, but rational decisions can still leave residue. When a station is closed because it is too difficult to operate safely, because it cannot be controlled, cannot be maintained at an acceptable standard, cannot justify the staffing it requires, the closure does not feel like an upgrade, it feels like an admission. The New York Transit Museum's public explanation of the closure emphasizes fare evasion, low ridership, and proximity to Franklin Avenue. These are the kinds of reasons that do not provoke outrage because they do not sound like danger, they sound like numbers. But fare evasion is not simply a financial metric, it is a measure of whether the system's physical controls are being obeyed. When those controls are repeatedly defeated at a particular site, the problem is operational, not moral. It means the station has become permeable in ways it was never designed to be. Over time, the story's simplified. The station was closed, then it was removed. A long-running catalog of abandoned stations describes the station as destroyed 1998. Tied directly to the reconstruction of the Franklin Shuttle and the decision not to replace the stop. Demolition is the subway's most complete form of forgetting. Many closed stations are left intact, sealed platforms, blocked stairways, because the system prefers to preserve options. Demolition preserves no option. It implies that the station's return would be worse than its absence. This finality is why Dean Street persists in conversation. A sealed station can be visited indirectly, seen through a train window, glimpsed as tiles in darkness. A demolished station can only be reconstructed through records, photographs, and oral memory. It becomes a story object, and story objects attract the kinds of explanations that the public record does not satisfy. The title that frames our investigation attaches Dean Street to the IRT Eastern Parkway Line and describes a closure after repeated operational failures. Taken literally, it is not consistent with the documented alignment. Dean Street was a station on the Franklin Avenue shuttle, while the Eastern Parkway Line is an IRT trunk. But misalignment is itself a clue to how transit memory works. In Brooklyn, especially around Franklin Avenue, the lines are interwoven in the rider's experience. Transfers collapse distinctions. Delays on one segment become crowding on another. A station name becomes shorthand for an entire corridor's dysfunction. The Eastern Parkway Line continues to operate through stations whose physical presence reinforces the system's age and the burden it carries. The platforms at Bergen Street in photographs show the standard A-division environment, narrow chambers, repeating columns, and a geometry that channels people into predictable places. Norstrand Avenue, another station on the trunk, exists close to major junction complexity and has the same heavy institutional architecture, a place designed to hold crowds briefly, not to comfort them. On this line, operational failures are often visible only in their consequences: trains held at signals, service changes, unexpected gaps. Public communication about these issues is sometimes reduced to terse updates: signal malfunction, maintainers en route. The brevity can feel like indifference. but it is more often a symptom of scale. When a system carries millions, the vocabulary of disruption becomes standardized. It cannot afford to be descriptive. This is where the psychological presence of a closed station becomes most persistent. A closed station becomes a symbol of the system's limits. The subway is an environment where most problems are framed as temporary. A station closure is not temporary. It is structural. It says that there are places where the city has retreated underground and does not intend to return. In the years after Dean Street's demolition, the line it served was rebuilt, resignaled, and reintroduced with a new operational logic. The rebuilt Franklin Shuttle became, in effect, a cleaner piece of system, simplified, modernized, more controllable. Dean Street's absence improved spacing and reduced the number of access points that had to be supervised. That is what closure accomplished, not a dramatic change in rider experience, but a reduction in the number of weak links. And yet, the weak link does not disappear entirely. It moves. When you remove a station because it is hard to control, you do not eliminate the behaviors that challenged control. You displace them to nearby locations. The Transit Museum's note about proximity to Franklin Avenue contains the subtle admission that the system expected riders to absorb the closure by using a different node. Franklin Avenue is better built, better staffed, more visible. It can carry the load. But that means it becomes a more intense environment during disruptions. It becomes, more often, a holding zone. In transit systems, holding zones create their own slow-burn horror, not the horror of violence or spectacle, but of compression. People packed into a space designed for flow, not for waiting. The air thickens. The sound changes. The tunnel becomes a source of anxiety because it refuses to deliver the expected train. The system's normal rhythms, the arrival, the doors, the departure, are interrupted. A functioning machine becomes a room full of people listening to silence. The darkest stories that persist about closed stations are usually not about what happened there, but about what did not happen. The station does not reopen. The station does not receive upgrades. The station does not become a community resource. It is erased, and the city continues as if the erasure were natural. Dean Street's erasure also means that most surviving documentation is administrative. Closure dates, demolition notes, brief public explanations. The New York Times treated the closure as a notable event precisely because it was rare. The abandoned station catalog treats demolition as a matter-of-fact endpoint. Between those 2 points lies the period that is hardest to reconstruct, the months and years when the station's problems were repeated often enough to justify closure, but not dramatic enough to create a single, definitive incident report that would survive in public memory. That is the shape of this mystery, not a missing event, but a missing accumulation. The station failed in small ways until it became clear that it would continue to fail. The failures were operational: control, maintenance, supervision, the ability of a system to maintain a boundary between safe movement and unsafe improvisation. And the Eastern Parkway Line, the trunk line named in the title, continues to demonstrate how repeated small failures become ambient. The line's age, its expansion into Crown Heights Utica Avenue by 1920, its century of service, means that modern operations are constrained by inherited geometry and infrastructure. The same junctions remain. The same ventilation patterns remain. Water still finds the same paths. Equipment is replaced, but the environment is constant. In that sense, a closed station like Dean Street becomes a warning about the limits of replacement. You can rebuild a line and still carry forward the conditions that produced failure. You can remove a station and still preserve the operational pressures that made it unmanageable. Today, if you stand on the Eastern Parkway Line at a station like Franklin Avenue, watching the trains arrive, listening to the announcements, observing how quickly a small delay changes the mood, you are watching the system's survival mechanism at work.
The subway is designed to keep moving. When it cannot, it becomes a place where time accumulates in enclosed rooms. The lasting psychological presence of Dean Street is not that it is haunted, it is that it was removed because the system could not promise normal operation there. That is the most honest form of fear in a city's infrastructure. Not that something unknown is hidden in the dark, but that the dark exists because the city decided it was easier to erase a place than to keep it reliably safe. And in Brooklyn, where the Franklin Shuttle meets the Eastern Parkway trunk, that decision still echoes, not as a legend, but as a practical reminder that operational failure, repeated often enough, eventually becomes policy.